Hi, everybody. So, when I posted the part 4 video just now, I realized that I overlapped a little bit, which is totally fine, but we went over the first Intifada twice, so sorry about that, but now you have double review. So, these slides I wanted to put on the review, even though there isn't there really isn't any text associated with them because you do need to know about the Israeli separation wall. This is a wall that roughly follows the 1949 Green Line, but we do know and we can see here that it does oftentimes move farther east, and that is an attempt to protect the Israeli settlements that exist within the West Bank. This also is to create a buffer zone in between Israeli and Palestinian territories. The Israeli government argues that this is for security, but the Palestinian peoples call this an apartheid wall. And the other thing that's significant about this buffer zone is that it comprises about 9.5% total of West Bank territory. So this actually effectively takes away more territory from the Palestinian people. All right, so we did these slides in class. So just really quickly, I want you guys to just sort of pause and look at different viewpoints, right? This is a view from the Palestinian side. Notice the graffiti. Also notice what the description shows us, that actually this house here is now effectively separated from its backyard by the wall. This is an image of a flyover road or a bypass road that allows Israelis to cut straight through Palestinian neighborhoods to reach their settlements. This is a checkpoint. You can see a Palestinian ambulance waiting to get inside Israel. And so this, of course, is significant because it further hinders access to certain health health resources for the Palestinians. Forgive me for stuttering a little bit there. This is a view of the wall from the Israeli perspective. It is fairly frequent for some parts of the wall to look aesthetically pleasing, and also a lot of the Israeli viewpoints of the wall are not located too close to private residences. So it's also a little bit more palpable for the Israelis in that sense. A photo of the first marathon in Palestine, or in the West Bank rather, and this is significant because actually it indicates to us that there is not enough space for people within the West Bank to run a full marathon uninterrupted. So this marathon course actually is 2 loops within Palestine, and you can see all the graffiti on the Palestinian side of the wall here. We see a group of Palestinians climbing the barrier fence to attend Ramadan services at their mosque. For them, it's easier and less time consuming to cross the wall illegally, but of course that leads to an increased risk. So we see that this wall creates a lot of problems and potentially some unintended ones. All right, this is Ramzi Taher Rafik, a Palestinian boy, and I wanted to include these images because, of course, this boy is around your age when these photos are taken, and this boy did not know a life prior to the life of the wall, and so he grows up effectively segregated from Israeli people. The encounters that he has with them are almost exclusively negative, and so we could consider how wall further contributes to this socio-spatial division between Israelis and Palestinian, and does not do much at all to sort of render the desire for peace. I just thought that this quote is a really good articulation of what I was just saying. And then last photo, we see an act of more active resistance. We could call this less so civil disobedience and more so peaceful confrontation or sabotage, because they are destroying property, but they are doing so and making a statement at the same time. All right, cool. We watched this video in class on Friday. These are the last 3 slides here. So if you were not here or if you wanted to rewatch this, this gives us a sense of what's going on in Gaza today. Last 2 slides. Awesome. We're almost through with our review, you guys. So, of course, we already talked about this with regard to the separation wall. The separation wall, if you forget, went up as a result of the Second Intifada, which took place between 2000 and 2005. And the Israeli government is continuing to argue that they will not allow Palestinians to self-govern and have full autonomy in their regions if the Israeli people cannot be guaranteed security. And part of this is a reaction to the increase of suicide bombings, particularly those that are orchestrated by Hamas. These suicide bombings begin to escalate after the Oslo Accords are not really followed through with in 1993, but they escalate even more rapidly during the Second Intifada. And it's also important for us in the background of our minds to consider that 9/11 occurs in the United States in 2011, and then shortly thereafter, the U.S. invades both Afghanistan and Iraq, and so their relationship between Muslim countries also deteriorates, which makes them more inclined to be a closer ally with Israel. And so you can ask the question, to what extent was there a proportionate response, both by the Israelis and by the Palestinians, in this sort of tit for tat argument that we continue to see, this volley back and forth, violent action? To what extent is an equal and opposite reaction orchestrated? And with that said, is that even a valid argument, right? If you subscribe to the eye for an eye theory, is that really an effective way to achieve a long and lasting peace? We already talked about separate roads, but this map here on the right shows us the different flyover and bypass roads, and also if you zoom in on the image on the right, if you're looking at slide 53, you can see which roads are Palestinian designated and which ones are Israeli designated, which is also really significant for you to take a look at. And we already talked about the significance of the wall acting as a buffer zone. It's called a seam zone in this slide, but again, as you can see, that takes up about 9.5% of the Palestinian designated territory, and effectively this buffer or seam zone acts as a demilitarized zone for security. Last slide. Okay, just thinking about the current situation in Gaza. All right, first off, Gaza is an incredibly densely populated region. It has a little less than 2 million people living in a strip of land that is less than half of the area of New York City. And you don't have as many high rise luxury buildings, of course, in a place like Gaza. In fact, you have none. Let's be honest. This is not a luxurious place to live. And so, even though you may say, well, New York has 8 million people living in it, it doesn't really matter. The population density is still much more prominent in a place like Gaza, and the infrastructure is crumbling to the point where the United Nations is arguing that in less than 2 years, the Gaza Strip will be an uninhabitable place in the world. And then what will happen to all these people if they become refugees, right? So, how did Gaza get to this point? Right. First off, going back to 2005, when Ariel Sharon, the Israeli prime minister, orchestrated the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, which means that all the Israeli settlers which were in the Gaza Strip were evacuated. After the evacuation, Gaza was sealed off with a wall. And not only was it sealed off with a wall, but the border between Gaza and Egypt was effectively closed. And so the only way in and out of Gaza for the Palestinian people was through checkpoints in and out of Israel. So effectively, Israel controls all the freedom of movement in and out of Gaza. It also controls the flow of goods, so they effectively can control how many resources go into Gaza, and the resources can be as simple as something like water or electricity or fuel. In 2006, we know that Hamas wins the elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council, but because Hamas was widely regarded as a terrorist organization by Israel, and also at this point by the United States ignores the result of these elections, and this is going to contribute to much more frustration on the part of Hamas. Hamas also conflicts with Fatah with regard to control over the region of Gaza, but because of the result of these elections, Hamas ultimately works to take matters into its own hands, and Hamas effectively controls the Gaza Strip at this point. And this, of course, has led to increased aerial strikes on behalf of the Israeli government, and so there's a lot of continued violence from Hamas and also from Israel that leads to this place being increasingly unstable. And the large amount of victims here are civilians. They are women, children, the elderly. They are the people that are losing their lives as a result of this conflict. And not all of them are losing their lives effectively because of violence, but many of them are just starving to death or are dying of thirst. And even if you do survive, most of the people that live in Gaza have no access to education whatsoever, and so we should not be surprised that many of these people choose to radicalize. They are born and raised thinking that Israeli people and also the United States and the West as a whole are their enemy, and so they don't particularly care about what the West thinks of them. You see videos of Palestinian people setting American flags on fire as a result of Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So this situation just gets worse, partially because of the sort of global reaction to it. After 2007, Israel constantly has used military force, particularly in the form of aerial strikes against Israel. And we see increased fuel shortages, lack of electricity. Sometimes electricity is cut off entirely. And yet again, it bears repeating that the UN is saying that this is an uninhabitable place by 2020. And so, to close really, really quickly, let's just go back to the essential questions at the very beginning of these slideshows to make sure that you guys are digesting this properly, right? And thinking about how you can anticipate maybe a TEA prompt, or thinking about how you could write a block narrative, or even thinking about how you can interpret a multiple choice question. Okay, so in the big picture, and these are questions that apply to English too, right? Think about the different factors: national, cultural, religious, age, even, how these things contribute to one's national identity and also cultural identity, and how one could say that as time goes on, it becomes increasingly difficult to find a solution because the younger people born into this conflict are increasingly likely to be radical in their ideas. Also, consider the significance of geography. Consider access to water, access to border crossings, what countries border, which regions, how surrounding Arab nations are going to be impacted by a refugee crisis. Consider how identifying with a particular group may lead to increased problems because you sort of have to pick one identity and maybe check another, if that makes sense. Let's say you live in Israel, but you are Palestinian by nature. You might have to make the decision, well, do I want to benefit from what Israeli civilians have access to, or do I want to reclaim my Palestinian identity, and what costs come with that? All right. And lastly, we can think about how our own identity might shape our view of this conflict. Whether we come from a certain religious identity, whether we come from a certain humanitarian identity, if we just have the desire to achieve peace, how does all this shape sort of the global impact of this topic? And I don't want to go over the guiding questions in detail, but these might be really helpful for you guys to anticipate, again, TEA prompts. So if I were you, I would pause this, I would take a look at these guided questions again, and you might want to think about examples that you could use to answer these questions. That would be really effective studying here. So I really hope that these videos were useful to you. I really hope that you're able to use them to get started with your studying. And another thing that I would advise you to do if you're watching these YouTube videos and you have questions for me, leave comments below. This is the easiest way for me to get in touch with you. I check this more often than I check my work email sometimes over the weekends. So if you want to get started studying and if you're confused, comment, right? It'll be so helpful. Okay, so that's it for the review videos. Good luck. You guys are going to be just fine on Tuesday. All right, I have utmost faith in you. All right. Take care. Thanks.